Hello, everyone, and welcome to ZAM Audiobook.
Thank you, Ali. I'm excited for today's discussion.
So, usually when we talk about a major structural collapse, like a massive skyscraper coming down, we picture this dramatic, sudden event.
Right, a wrecking ball or an earthquake or something highly visible and chaotic.
Exactly. But if you talk to any structural engineer, they will tell you that the most dangerous failures, they don't start with an earthquake. They start years earlier, completely invisible, right down on the foundation.
Yeah, just a microscopic crack in the concrete or maybe a slow leak that's rusting out the rebar.
Yeah, and the building looks magnificent on the outside, right? But underneath, the root system is just rotting away. And then one day, under just a totally normal amount of wind or pressure, the whole thing caves in.
It's an erosion that happens so quietly, long before anyone ever actually hears the crash.
And that brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. We're exploring the true root system of authority, which fundamentally redefines what it means to actually be in charge.
Yeah, because we aren't talking about giving soaring speeches or holding some fancy title or demanding compliance from a team.
No, not at all. The central, hard-hitting premise we're unpacking today is simply this. Leadership doesn't begin when others follow you. It begins when you stop being ruled by your own mind.
Which honestly completely flips the traditional script. I mean, we've all been sold this idea that leadership is an external performance.
Oh, totally. Like it's charisma or influence tactics.
Right, or how you project yourself in a meeting or how you dominate a negotiation. But when you strip all of that away, a very stark reality emerges. You can have skyrocketing intelligence and bulletproof confidence and immense external power, but you absolutely cannot lead sustainably if you cannot lead yourself.
We're setting the stakes really high right out of the gate for you listening today. Because if you think about every breakdown in leadership, whether that's a toxic dynamic at work or a fracture in your family or a collapse in a community, it almost never starts with a bad logical decision on a spreadsheet.
No, it starts internally. It starts with a moment of lost control, an unchecked emotion or a standard that you compromised just that one time because you chose comfort over discipline.
And the moment the internal compromise happens, your authority just starts to leak. People might not confront you on it, but human beings are biologically wired to be incredibly highly attuned to the micro-expressions and the emotional states of the people leading them.
It is an evolutionary survival trait. We constantly monitor the leader of the pack. So when your internal foundation cracks, people feel it instantly.
So our goal today is to strip leadership down to its absolute unglamorous core. We are going to explore how you can develop that quiet, invisible self-command.
Because we want to give you the mechanics to remain totally grounded under pressure so that when the world around you gets unimaginably loud, your internal foundation holds firm.
And that requires solitude, first and foremost, quiet thinking.
Yes, absolutely. Because before anyone trusts your direction or even really processes the strategic words coming out of your mouth, they instinctively sense your internal state.
Right.
So the absolute first threshold of leadership before vision or strategy even enter the picture has to be self-awareness and emotional mastery. And you cannot get self-awareness if you are constantly drowning in noise.
Let's unpack this emotional mastery part, because I have to admit, self-control can sound like a really rigid, kind of unappealing concept.
It sounds exhausting.
Yeah, it sounds like stuffing your feelings down until you inevitably explode, or just becoming this emotionally numb robot in the office.
It is a common misconception, for sure. But true emotional mastery isn't about suppressing who you are. It is about governing who you become in high-stakes moments.
I like that distinction.
Yeah, and it really comes down to a crucial mechanical difference between an emotion and an impulse.
Walk us through that mechanism. How does that work?
Well, emotion is just information. It's biological data. So your brain perceives a threat and it floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline. That is the emotion.
Okay, just chemistry.
Right. Impulse, on the other hand, is a reaction. It's what you do with that chemical flood. Self-control is simply the space you create between receiving that biological data and executing a reaction. Real leadership lives entirely in that gap.
I used to think of emotional regulation like a thermostat, where you're just reading the room and adjusting the heat. But honestly, a better way to look at it is like a crumple zone in a car.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because if you're driving and you hit a wall, the crumple zone is engineered to absorb all the violent kinetic energy of the crash, crunching and folding, so that the passenger cabin, which represents your team or your family, stays completely intact and safe.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it.
Because if you don't have that internal crumple zone, the shockwave of every single crisis goes straight into the people around you.
Exactly, and the danger arises when we identify too closely with the crash itself. There is a massive, almost life-changing psychological difference between the phrase, "I am angry," and the phrase, "anger is present."
It's just a few words, but the internal shift there feels huge.
Yeah.
How does that actually change what's happening in our brains?
Well, when you say "I am angry," you're basically fusing your entire identity with a temporary emotional state. You are letting the amygdala, which is the fear and threat center of your brain, take complete control of the steering wheel.
You literally become the anger.
Yes. But when you say anger is present, you are observing the emotion as a separate entity. You regain psychological distance. Neurologically, you are literally routing processing power away from the amygdala and back into the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic and reasoning.
Wow. So just observing it changes the hardware response?
Exactly. When you observe an emotion, it loses its authority over you. But when you obey it, it gains total control.
Which brings up a dynamic that I think everyone listening has experienced at some point. A leader who cannot regulate themselves forces others to regulate around them.
It is the exact definition of a team walking on eggshells.
Right. I mean, if you are listening to this on your commute, just think about a boss you've had who was totally unpredictable. One day they are overly enthusiastic, and the next day they are slamming doors because an email had a typo.
Yeah, we've all been there.
If you are that emotionally volatile, your team isn't using their cognitive energy to solve problems or innovate for the company. They are using all their energy to scan your mood, to predict what will trigger you today, and to basically manage your emotional state.
You are forcing them to do the emotional labor that you are failing to do yourself. You become a massive cognitive drain on the system rather than a pillar of stability.
So once you realize you need to stop draining the system, once you've managed to build that crumple zone and create that crucial space between feeling the emotion and reacting to it, what actually goes into that space?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, like what structural forces do you rely on to make a decision when the pressure is really on? And the answer to that relies on two very specific things: discipline and standards.
This brings up a really important tension in how we typically try to achieve our goals. Because most people rely on motivation to fill that space. We wait until we feel inspired to do the hard thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But motivation is just fleeting emotional energy. It requires ideal conditions. You need to have slept well, your coffee needs to be perfect, and people need to be cheering you on.
But wait, I have to push back on this a little. We live in a culture that absolutely glorifies motivation. The whole startup hustle mindset is completely built on it. Isn't motivation usually the spark that gets us started in the first place? Why is it positioned as something so unreliable?
Motivation isn't bad for starting, but it is disastrous for maintaining. Think about the biological mechanism behind it. Motivation is heavily tied to dopamine, which is biologically designed to spike when a goal is new and exciting.
So it's literally an evolutionary trick.
Exactly. But dopamine inevitably crashes. It always does. Motivation creates the illusion of permanent change, but leadership isn't about what you do when you feel great.
So what replaces it when the dopamine is gone and it's cold and raining out?
Discipline. Because discipline relies on creating actual neural pathways through repetition, completely bypassing the emotion center of the brain.
Automatic.
Yes. Discipline is what functions when conditions are completely wrong, when your energy is at zero, and when absolutely no one is watching to give you credit. When a crisis hits, you do not rise to the level of your potential or your motivation. You fall to the level of your trained discipline.
You fall to the level of your trained discipline. That is incredibly sobering. And that discipline is built on what we call standards, because standards are the actual architecture of your authority.
Right, not your title.
Yeah, a title is just a label they put on your office door. A standard is a lived rule. It's a line you simply do not cross. Even when crossing it would be infinitely easier.
And we really have to draw a very hard line here between standards and preferences. A lot of leaders think they have standards, but what they really have are preferences.
Let's ground this for the listener with a real-world scenario, because the difference here is everything. Let's say you run a creative agency and you have a standard that your team doesn't work weekends. You preach about work-life balance all the time.
A very common scenario.
Right. But then it's the end of Q4. Budgets are tight, and your biggest client demands a massive revision by Monday morning. If you cave and force your team to work Saturday to keep the client happy, then work-life balance was never a standard. It was just a preference.
Yep.
Preferences change based on the weather and the pressure. Standards do not.
A standard costs you something. It costs you money, it costs you comfort, or it costs you a client. If it doesn't cost you anything to uphold, it is not a standard.
But that sounds great in theory, right? In reality, business requires agility. How do we tell the difference between holding a rigid standard and just being stubbornly inflexible? People get nervous about setting strict standards because they don't want to seem unapproachable.
It is a fair concern, but it misunderstands human psychology completely. Ambiguity is actually the true enemy of authority, not strictness.
Oh, that's interesting. Say more about that.
Well, when you have shifting standards, when your team doesn't know if you're going to fold under pressure, you create ambiguity. People don't know where the lines are, so they constantly test boundaries out of deep uncertainty.
That makes sense.
Strong leaders who uphold unwavering standards are often misunderstood from the outside as rigid, but what they are actually doing is protecting clarity. They are creating psychological safety because everyone knows exactly what to expect, even in a crisis.
So the culture you create isn't what you preach in a mission statement on the wall. It is what you tolerate on a random Tuesday afternoon. If you tolerate excuses, you literally teach your team to make excuses.
And because discipline and standards simplify your choices, they remove that exhausting internal debate of should I or shouldn't I? And that naturally produces the next vital leadership trait, which is clarity.
Clarity really is the pivot point here, because clarity is what allows a leader to stop reacting and start responding. And developing independent thinking in a distracted world really hinges on this.
Absolutely. We often confuse confidence with an emotion, like this feeling of being pumped up or fearless or having total swagger. But if you look at the mechanics of effective leadership, confidence is rarely an emotion at all. It is simply a byproduct of clarity.
Meaning, when the mental clutter is gone.
Yes. When your conflicting priorities and unexamined beliefs are stripped away by your standards, hesitation just disappears. You don't have to pretend to have all the answers. A clear leader can comfortably acknowledge total uncertainty while still maintaining a firm direction.
Let's talk about how that clarity changes our behavior in the heat of the moment, because there is a profound difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is fast, it's highly emotional, it's driven by the ego or by fear.
Yes, it's impulsive.
When you react, you are essentially seeking to discharge your own internal tension. Your sympathetic nervous system is freaking out, and you just want the discomfort out of your body, so you lash out.
Reacting is entirely about personal relief. Responding, however, seeks to resolve the situation. A response is intentional, it's restrained, and it's highly economical with words. A reaction escalates the chaos, while a response absorbs it.
When we talk about reacting, there's this concept of losing altitude in a conflict that I want to explore. But honestly, I've struggled with it in practice. The idea is that when someone triggers you and you react, you're pulled into their emotional field. You lose altitude and you start fighting on the exact same level as the chaos. But if you're in a meeting and someone directly challenges you or raises their voice, my instinct is that choosing a deliberate pause, just sitting there in silence, makes me look weak, like I'm capitulating. Why does silence actually signal power here?
It feels like weakness because our ego screams at us to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
But think of it in terms of gravity. When a conflict happens, there is a massive gravitational pull toward chaos. If someone yells, the immediate biological instinct is to yell back to establish dominance.
Fight or flight.
Right. But if you do that, you've surrendered your altitude. You are no longer leading the interaction. You are being completely led by their provocation.
You're basically just reacting to their script.
Exactly. Choosing the pause, even just 3 seconds of total silence, is an active refusal to be dragged down. It signals to everyone in the room that your internal state is not subject to external weather.
Wow.
That pause preserves your dignity because it visually demonstrates that you are in full control of your faculty. And here is the mechanism behind why it works. Silence creates a vacuum. When someone is acting irrationally and you don't match their energy, that vacuum forces them to hear their own irrationality.
Like a mirror.
Yes, and it instantly signals capacity to others. If you can manage yourself under fire, they instinctively trust you can manage the situation.
So it's not passive avoidance. It is highly strategic silence. It allows the other person's volatile cortisol spike to burn off, And it prevents you from saying something you will inevitably regret. You don't lose authority by pausing, you gain it.
Because silence is heavy. It carries weight. When you respond economically, only saying exactly what needs to be said, your words become incredibly valuable. People lean in to listen because they know you aren't just leaking emotional noise, you are delivering a resolution.
So what happens when we put this all together over a long timeline? When you repeatedly apply this clarity, when you consistently choose to respond rather than react, you are establishing a pattern. And over time, that consistent pattern crystallizes into the ultimate forms of influence, which are character and presence.
Consistency is the absolute bridge between action and trust. People do not trust what you say once, no matter how eloquently or passionately you say it. They trust what you do again and again, especially when it is highly inconvenient for you.
Consistency proves it wasn't just a mood.
Right. You can have all the natural talent in the world, but talent without consistency just creates anxiety in a team.
And as that consistency becomes your identity, leadership stops being a hat you put on when you walk into the office.
Yeah.
It stops being an act. It stops being something you do and becomes something you embody. You don't have to try to lead anymore.
And that embodiment fundamentally changes how you communicate. True leaders rarely explain themselves excessively. Over-explanation is almost always a signal of insecurity. It is a subconscious plea for validation. Quiet presence, on the other hand, signals certainty.
There's a term for this mature leadership state, holding space. But that can sound like HR jargon. What does holding space actually mean in the real world?
Well, therapists use the term holding space a lot, but in a regular office or a living room, it just means you don't absorb someone else's panic. If an employee comes to you freaking out about a lost client, or a family member comes to you with a crisis, you don't match their heart rate.
You stay steady.
You become a brick wall that their anxiety bounces off of. You remain centered without collapsing under the weight of your own emotions, and crucially, without collapsing under the weight of theirs.
I think about it like an anchor during a massive storm at sea. The anchor doesn't rush around the deck trying to negotiate with the wind, or yelling at the waves to calm down, or trying to forcibly control the ocean. It simply sinks into the bedrock and holds its ground.
I love that visual.
It's the holding that creates stability. And that stability is what allows the rest of the ship, whether that's your team or your family, to survive the storm and figure out what to do next.
That is the absolute essence of presence. You absorb the shockwave so they don't have to.
And ultimately, that anchor, that character, is revealed in the unglamorous moments. Character isn't what you do on a stage. Character is how you treat people when absolutely nothing is at stake. It is how you behave when keeping quiet and slipping out the back door would be so much easier than standing up with integrity.
Character is the ultimate leadership asset because it is the only thing that remains when all your external authority is stripped away. Charisma fades, budgets dry up, titles change. But influence built on consistent character endures.
It just compounds.
It compounds quietly over years. When you become the standard, people follow not because you demand it, but because it simply makes sense to follow someone so incredibly grounded.
So let's pull all of this together for you. We've covered a massive journey today. We've learned that true authority isn't about demanding compliance. It is an architecture built entirely from the inside out.
It begins with that invisible foundation of self-control. It moves to mastering rather than suppressing your emotions by building that internal crumple zone. It relies on the iron framework of discipline over the fleeting, dopamine-driven high of motivation.
And it is sustained by upholding unwavering standards, acting from crystal clarity, and choosing to respond with a strategic pause rather than reacting out of panic.
And it all culminates in building deep trust through unrelenting The beauty of this framework is that you don't need a promotion to start using it. You don't need a stage or a budget or an audience. You can start today, right now, in the smallest, most uncelebrated moments.
If you want to put this into practice today, start by simply pausing for 3 seconds before firing off a reply to that frustrating email. Start by keeping a tiny promise you made to yourself about going for a walk, even though it's raining and no one would know if you stayed on the couch.
Just start by choosing clarity over noise.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to mull over today. Something to really challenge how you view your own position in whatever spheres you operate in. Ask yourself this: if all your external titles, your formal authority, your budget, and your power to hire and fire were completely stripped away today, Would the people around you still choose to follow you, based purely on the internal character and the emotional composure you consistently display?
It is a profound question because it forces us to look past the facade and examine the actual root system of our lives.
It really does. So before you worry about leading a team or leading a family or leading an industry, remember the foundation of that skyscraper. Lead yourself first. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care, and we will see you next time.